But it's important to first start with thinking about Africa itself as a continent. Africa is gigantic, okay? I think we often don't think of it in this way. The size of Africa, it's larger than the US, China, Japan, and Europe, and other countries, as you see here. I like this map because it actually puts them all into the African continent and shows you just how gigantic it is. It's the second largest continent in the world. And I wanted to start this lecture by talking about Seydou Keita. He was a very important photographer who was working in the mid 20th century, so in the 60s and 70s. And here's one of his key pieces here. And the reason why I like to talk about him is because we can talk about him within the frame of independence, because Africa was under French rule for much of its early history, and then it's not until the 60s that it gains independence. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But because he also introduces sitters of his photographs into kind of a role of modern selfhood. So for the first time, we really have the sitter, the subject, and the photographer becoming authoritative, having a role, a modern selfhood. We also see here that through his work we see photography as a site of self-definition, and in one that is rejecting the colonial power's gaze. So first, let's talk a little bit about independence. So Seydou Keita is a photographer from Mali, and here you see a map of Africa. So this is in Western Africa that we're looking at. So Mali is very multi-ethnic. Over 50 languages are spoken. Of these, French is the official language. Altogether, 13 of the indigenous languages of Mali have the legal status of a national language. And as you can see here within this map, you can see the French West Africa in 1913. It's important to note, as I just said, that Mali fought for and won its independence from France in 1960. So that's still pretty contemporary. And this is within the context where we see Seydou Keita working. So he's become kind of known as the great African portraitist. Living in Bamako, Mali, he lived there from 1921 to 2001. Here's two portraits of him, a self-portrait of himself, and then another more contemporary self-portrait of him with his Rolleiflex camera. He was a self-taught photographer. He opened his studio in 1948 and specialized in portraiture. And this is an important thing because it's prior to this time, Africans were not, portraiture was not often used as something that would one would take buy of themselves or give to someone else, right? Photography was used as a mode of control prior to this point, and so he's kind of one of the first photographers who takes pictures, portraits of people, and allows them to be seen how they want to be seen. And we'll talk about this more in just a second. And now it's important to know that Bamako is actually an internationally recognized place for exceptional photographers and photographic work. People go there from all over. There's conferences, important conferences there, and museums that are dedicated to photography. So as I said, Keita is considered a leader of the classic tradition of studio photographers working in Mali. I don't know what that is. Sorry about that. Here we are. In the 50s, he also worked in commercial portrait photography as early as the 1930s. And that's where it ended up, I'm sorry, he didn't work it, but that's where we end up seeing commercial photography coming to Africa, coming to Bamako in the 30s. So here's one of his important portraits. Before I change to the next slide, I want you to notice how this woman looks straight at us, right? This is a portrait where the woman, she gazes right back at the viewer, right? She's actually kind of confrontational. And this is very different from what we've seen prior to the photographer's work. So as I said, um, um, before Keita's work, we have photography used primarily as a tool of control by the French government over the African peoples. So here we have a couple of photographs where Africans are actually being photographed to surveil. To surveil them. So the French used photography as a tool of surveillance and control, reducing Africans to types, reducing them to racial types for the colonial state itself. So this is when Africa is under French colonial rule and when it's important to keep track of people, right? And this is how you keep track of people, is by taking photographs of them, criminalizing and surveilling them in such a way. You also see a photograph here, which is very much an ethnographic study by a French photographer, looking as the African as the other, as someone, you know, who's very different than contemporary French folk. And so both of these modes of both using photography to control people in the continent, but also to reduce them to a type, were something that, you know, Keita resisted in his works. So you see here the comparison that he rejected the colonial gaze. Here I'm talking about the colonial gaze, right? The gaze of the French colonizers upon the face of the African people. And instead he insisted on their subjectivity, individuality, and modern selfhood. So look at this woman and how she differs from the portrait of the woman on the right. She is an individual. She gazes right at us. She's subjective, right? She's a person. She's not just a type, right? She has a name. She has an identity. This is her version of her vision of herself. It's important to bring up here that the photographer also had a huge closet full of clothes and props, different things that his sitters could come and put on, so they could decide exactly how they wanted to be seen, versus, you know, the woman here, the profile, who, you know, doesn't get to decide how she's seen. She's told to pose in this way, and that's how she's depicted. Okay, the other thing that is important to bring up with Seydou Keita is that he employed a lot of layering within his work, so combining pattern on pattern, as you see here. He also was really interested in employing different backdrops within his work. You can see he's playing here with surface and depth, so that the backdrop actually seems to kind of coexist in a very interesting way with the figure in the foreground. So he kind of weaves the figure in and out of the backdrop by using these very similar patterns and by using black and white here. Both of these images are key to that. The other important thing about his work is that he modernized these people. These people, people who were wanting their portraits taken in the 60s in Bamako, wanted to be seen as contemporary cosmopolitan people, right? They didn't want to be seen as the rest of the world saw, you know, people of the African continent, which was very old-fashioned. The contemporary, today even, we seem to have this idea that people in the African continent exist in the past, and that they are running around in tribes, that they're not modern, right? But that's not true. That's not true at all. Of course, there are some people in the African continent within certain communities who do, and we'll look at a community in just a second, who are living kind of on the outskirts of contemporary society. But we also have to understand that there's a very modern community of people who are living in giant cosmopolitan cities in Africa, who are very kind of modern, who are very stylish, who are very refined, and these people wanted to be represented in such a way. So this woman would have come to Keita's studio and picked out her dress, right? These objects, she holds a flower. This is a symbol of a contemporary woman, right? It's also a symbol of delicacy. the finer things in life, right? Here she's emphasizing her modern dreams and her ambitions as part of this cosmopolitan world of Bamako. She's fashionable, she's refined, she's stylish. She looks much like, you might think a contemporary of the 60s woman might wear in France, things that a woman might wear in France. The same kind of thing is happening here with this image, with this portrait. Again, we have use of the flower, an interest in the finer things in life, right? This man, he also shows off his watch, his pen. He's got a pocket protector. He wears this really nice kind of suit. Yeah, today you might see this image and think he's a contemporary hipster, right? He's got the wide black rimmed glasses, um, um, a short cut hair, this amazing tight suit. And all of this is really just to show off his power to consume global commodities, right? Perhaps this is a French suit, maybe it's a European suit of some sort. He's also a man who's an intellectual. He's of the middle class, and he's wanting to show that in this image as he gazes right at us, right? He is an individual. He has a name, right? He's resisting the kind of typing and ethnographic typing of prior photographs of the African people, and showing you that he's a contemporary man, right? He has a watch. He knows what time it is. He's always going to be on time. He's a man of the mind. He's interested in the finer things. Look at this beautiful, delicate flower he holds. Even the use of his glasses, right, to kind of convey an intellectualism. So all of these things are very important at this time, and this is very characteristic of Keita's work. Here again we see a few more examples, right? We have these people are not represented as like anti-European, right? It's not an African versus a European way of looking, but rather a more broad urban cosmopolitanism. So both of these women are photographed with all sorts of contemporary kind of modes of expressing power. So jewelry, for instance, look at all these earrings, this contemporary watch, rings, all this type of thing. And then here we have a radio, right? And of course today we're thinking like, what? That's such an old school radio. But in the 50s and 60s, this would have been an object of new technology, right? That she's someone who listens to the radio. She keeps up on contemporary local news, perhaps contemporary music. She listens to contemporary music. So all of these things, again, affirming the individual as one who can represent themselves through photography. And Seydou Keita has influenced a variety of contemporary African artists who are still working today. Omar Victor Diop is one of these photographers. He's works in fine arts, but also fashion photography, as well as advertising photography. And you can see here his interest again in specifically the layering of pattern on pattern, but also in the way that he represents the contemporary intellectual is very much tied to kind of this urban, global cosmopolitanism. Hassan Hajjaj is another one of these artists who looks very much to Keita's work. Historians have called him the contemporary Andy Warhol of the African continent, and you can see why in some ways. He's really interested in kind of popular culture. There's an interest in pop art here, but here again, he's also interested in that layering of the patterns that we also see Keita using. And here are a few more of his pieces. And the next thing I want to talk about, switching gears completely, because I want you to start thinking about your discussion for this week, is to think about Nkisi and Kondai. And these are basically vessels for containing spiritual forces. So I'm going to have a lot of text here, but there's a lot to get through. So I'm just going to kind of get going on it. So here we have a Nkisi and Kondai. This is a wooden sculpture. Once carved, it becomes responsibility of a ritual specialist named Ngong. and that's the word you see here, and I'll repeat it a few times for you in the next few slides. But this would be the kind of person who was charged with taking care of such an object. And these objects would help a person to see beyond this world into the world of the ancestors and the sacred. So these are objects which are activated in certain ways through how we engage with them and how their owners and how their caretakers, the Nganga, would actually take care of them. So the Nganga fills the special cavity, and you can see here there's a central cavity in the sculpture. Generally it will be in the stomach region. Sometimes it also is up on the head. So the caretaker would actually fill this with some sort of material, sometimes an ash, soil, or herbs that are attributed to medicine or some sort of sacred properties to help the person that the figure is supposed to help. So over time, clients approach the Nganga and seek solutions or to problems in their life. Oftentimes it might be a health problem. And so that request might be added to the Nikisi's exterior, oftentimes through the pounding of a nail. You can see here these figures are also called nail figures. So if you look it up on Google or something, if you write an African nail figure, you'll see these figures as well. But here you see, in terms of this object, cloth has been added, cowrie shells, beads, ropes, and as I said, nails, that's most common, have been added to it. And so over time it becomes layered with these objects and these materials, becoming more visually complex but also more powerful, right? It actually holds more power once every nail or shell or rope or bead is attached onto the figure. So they're activated, as I said, and you have to think about this when you're writing your discussion post this week. They're activated because they act as a form of communication between the two worlds, and that is this world and the world of our ancestors within African tradition. And it translates the dialogue between this world and that world, because there are certain things and events in and of themselves that can only be known by ancestors or by God. And this is something that not only is sacred to the African traditions that we're talking about here, but also for those of you who practice different religions, such as Catholicism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. These are things that are broad beliefs that, that people hold, is that there are certain things in life that only our ancestors and gods can help us with. I'll focus on this Nikisi Nkondai for just a second. They can have many functions. So this one particularly is used as a record keeper of sanctioned agreements. So these would often be used as record keepers in a court of law. So if we look closely at this one, this Nikisi harnesses powerful spirits or sacred forces, but does not literally represent a spirit. It is believed to have the power to uncover sources of affliction or some sort of problem to help one see clearly. And the reason why we have the figure of the dog in terms of seeing clearly is because the dog in this context, a kozo, is seen in a positive way. It is believed that dogs were able to see into this world and the world of the ancestors. And so for that reason, we have the two-headed dog, one who sees this world and one who sees the world of the ancestors. So the dog is able to kind of help those living within the world, our world today, to understand the things that ail them, their problems. So dogs are linked to this kind of final journey of the soul. A traditional saying states that the soul passes through the village of dogs on the way to the village of the afterlife. So the dog would guide one from this life to the next. And so the dog becomes a very important symbol. And as you can see here, again, we have the nails being added, a variety of different kind of sharp objects, cloth, beads, and so forth. Okay, and I think that's all I'm going to say about that one. I've already talked about the Ngong. So they can also, as I've said, serve as administrators of justice. Participants in legal proceedings may have sworn oaths or made agreements in the presence of a certain power figure in a kisi and kandai. For instance, this one would have functioned in that way. And so if you were bound to a legal agreement, when you were making such an agreement, you'd have to nail a nail into this figure as you're swearing an oath, okay? And if you were to go back on that agreement, then, you know, the spirit associated with this power figure would come after you and something bad would happen to you. So it's actually functions within a court of law to make sure justice is served. And some have also talked about this practice of piercing the nikisi with nails or spikes as adopted from Christian imagery. And so here we have an image of the martyred saint, Saint Sebastian, from the 1480s. So some have linked this, you know, it's something that I thought was interesting in my research. But it's something I thought I would just bring up. I'm not going to go into it, but something that maybe some of you might be interested in is this link between African tradition and then the tradition of Christianity. And that brings me then to talking about display and context. So if we think about these objects, the nikisi, which are very much activated by the motion of the person who's using the object, the nganga, perhaps, who's nailing the nail into the figure, either making some sort of agreement sacred or seeking healing by allowing us to communicate with the world of our ancestors. So if these are very sacred objects which are activated in such a way, how do we display them then? Or, my question would be, and for the discussion, is it even ethical to display these types of things? And I think this also goes very much as a question towards masks that are used within masquerades. So here you see a variety of masks. We're going to look specifically at galete, sowo masks that we're going to look at here. Your book talks about a few different kind of masquerade traditions where children are involved. Here we have the Yoruba culture involved in a masquerade where we have costumes and these masks. The book also talks about traditions that are specific to Sierra Leone, where we have the Sowo, or the women as part of the Sunday Society, who are doing these masquerades very much tied to the initiation of young girls. And so here again you see, and this is another, I think, an image that is in your book as well, so you can see just how these are used in the context of the small villages where we have them being used. And I also wanted to say that I did post a short little video of a performance. It's only, I think it's just maybe a minute long, so you can actually see someone performing in one of these masquerade contexts on Blackboard. But let's talk a little bit about the Sunday Society itself. So the Sunday Society of Sierra Leone, they're responsible for the creation of these masks. The Sunday Society is a women's society specifically. The performance arts of the Women's Association is basically the Sunday Society here. So you have the mask that's used. And just to give you an idea of where we are here again, we're in Western Africa. Sierra Leone and Liberia are the two kind of areas where we have a lot of these masquerades taking place. But just to give you an idea, you know, Freetown is just a gigantic city. It's the capital of Sierra Leone. It's internationally oriented. Its population is estimated at 1.2 million. So this is not like your typical ideas that we might have associated with African cities. As I said, might be look a lot more like this, right? These remote cities where we have people living just on the fringes of society. But we also have these big, booming metropolises with millions of people. But we also do have these remote Mende villages in Sierra Leone. And this is where I'm going to go right now to talk about the Sande Society. This is the Women's Association. It's for women only. Sande is found in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and also Guinea. It is traditionally responsible for initiating girls into adulthood and more generally championing women's social and political interests. So if we think about kind of the role of women today within these societies, it's actually quite liberating for these women to have this sort of society where it's exclusive to women, where they can kind of talk about their concerns socially and politically with one another. There's also a men's society called the Poro. So in terms of the art we're looking at, the wooden mask is associated with the Sande Society. You see it depicted here at the top of a much more elaborate costume. It would have been worn with a black raffia costume at important civic events. So this could be when important dignitaries visiting or during a funeral of an important chief. It's particularly, however, associated with girls' initiation ceremonies and is unique in Africa in being owned and worn, if not made by women. And so typically you have men who are making masks, but here you have women who are making and wearing the masks. So the goal of the Sande Society is basically to teach young women, Mende women, the responsibilities of adulthood. Girls are taught to be hardworking, modest in their behavior, especially towards their elders. You see here women who are preparing for their initiation performance with the Sande Society, and they, of course, wear the Sowo costume with these masks. Also part of the ceremony, or part of the initiation, is that these young girls have to paint their bodies white and kind of go out into the wilderness for a series of days where they have to kind of find themselves before coming back and then performing part of the masquerade. Alright, so the mask itself, it's called a Sowo. This is a symbol of female power. The mask and the costume are called Sowo, after the supernatural entity which represents the Sande Society enters into the performance. So the Sowo is basically a spirit or a divinity that's manifested in the masquerade, in the performance itself. This is also the highest title of someone in the Sande Society. So if you are the if you are an elder who's important to the Sande Society, you also would be called a Sowo. But for the purposes here, we'll talk about the kind of the spirit or divinity that activates the mask and the costume as being Sowo. And there's an iconography associated with this as well. So if you look here, we've got kind of a large forehead. We've got poise, self-confidence, elegance, intellect, a contemplative mind. These are all the ideals of a Sande woman. All can be associated with that kind of large forehead. Closed, slitted eyes. These are downcast eyes symbolizing a spiritual nature, and it is through these small slit eyes that women wear the mask and would look out of. So you can imagine if you were wearing this, your eyes would, you'd be able to see out right here. Here you have the lips. They're kind of pursed. They're very serious. This is a mood of composure and control, right? Women are supposed to be kind of composed, serious, and controlled within the society. Hair is very elegant. Here it depicts wealth, right? This is very kind of civilized type of hairstyle. It's very elaborate. We also have scars that are markings on the cheeks. They're representations of the scars girls receive as they step into womanhood. The scars are a symbol of new life and of a harder life. So those are represented here down the sides of the cheeks. The neck rings are another important iconography that we see here. These can actually, these rings represent fertility. So they actually, part of their symbolism is tied to fat, neck fat, rolls, if you will. Or well-being, right? A well-fed woman who will be fertile and be able to bear children. And this has much to do with transition from child to adult. They also represent ripples of water because the Sowo, this divine creature, is actually known to be associated with the water. She comes deep from the water's depths. And so the ripples of water are a symbol of that. They're also a symbol of a chrysalis. Some researchers have seen these as rolls of flesh. As I said, they might echo the chrysalis of a certain butterfly, symbolizing the girls coming out of their, coming out of their shell as butterflies, right? Caterpillars going, becoming butterflies, transforming, if you will, into beautiful women. And then here we actually have a still of the masquerade itself, the dance. And as I said, I have a short video where you can see it in action on Blackboard. As I said, it celebrates children becoming women, kind of a rite of passage. Also celebrates important political events, welcomes dignitaries, presents unity of all men, day, women, and it also has been used to entertain. So sometimes there will be kind of comic, entertaining masquerades tied to the Sunday society as well. It's important also to note that a woman who wears these masks must not expose any part of her body. As you can see here, she's completely covered in raffia and then the mask itself, and she's kind of got like a black sweatshirt of some sort, socks, shoes, and she's making sure her hands aren't shown because it's believed that if she exposes any part of her body, the sacred power of the Sowo would overtake her. Women often cover their bodies with masses of raffia, as you see here, or black cloth. And more contemporarily, well, not that this one's old, but this is, I believe, from the 80s. But people have become interested, right, in African heritage and these masquerades within the art community. So here we have a Sowe performance at Spirit of Sierra Leone, an exhibition at the British Museum on the day of the opening. So here we actually have this type of thing, this performance, which is, initiated in a remote community in Africa, brought into the contemporary gallery space in the British Museum. And then how does that actually change the ritual itself? So this brings me to the questions that are going to be posed this week in your discussion forum. So think about this. This is how you're supposed to see the mask, right? In motion, activated, becoming Sowo, becoming this divine spirit as an act of initiation for girls. But then you have these masks that are taken away from that context, right? What is wrong with this? And so I don't really want to talk too much about it, but I want you to think about this. Is this okay? Are you happy seeing these types of displays for these masks in glass boxes like this, completely deactivated? Here again we have some African arts that are being displayed. Here again we have more African arts being displayed. So you can talk about whatever you want to talk about in your post. Make sure you read the prompt carefully. You can talk about a variety of different objects. You can talk about the Nkisi and Kondai. You can talk about the masks. You can talk about the spirit spouses, which are covered also in your chapter. And I believe maybe in one of the videos I posted. But the question really is, how does is context important here? Is this context that we see here represented within these communities important because it's completely stripped from the object here? So think about these things as you prepare for that discussion. Apologies for the late post. I'll try next week to post on Sunday night or Monday night. But thank you so much for your questions you've been asking and the communication that you've been engaging with me. And I hope to hear from some of you soon. And let me know if you have any questions about the paper or about anything that's happening in this lecture. And I hope you have a great week.